So this is a shot I was working on for a friend of mine, and as you can see, it's a pretty big scene. There are lots of shiny objects, lots of matte objects, things that are reflecting. There's glass. So what I really need to find out is how I can get a really good render and not have it take forever. Because sometimes you can change your render settings and get what I call like overkill. So first things first is to set up your camera. So I have a few cameras, and this is the camera I'm going to be looking through for my renders. So my camera 3, and I'm going to go into my render settings. So let's go to Window, Rendering Editors, Render Settings. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about all of the settings here under the common, but all the settings found here under the Arnold render. Now Arnold has like presets, and you can load presets, and there's you know, like default settings, and then there's user. So I actually saved a preset called final render, but again, every scene is going to be completely different. Like my values are 6, 3, 3, 4, 3, and 1. These might work great on some of your scenes, but it might be overkill on others because there might not be as many reflective objects or as many refractive objects like glass. So I'm going to click on presets and then just load default settings. So these are probably what your settings look like right now. Alright, I'm going to start off with the camera AA at a value of 1. I'm going to change my diffuse to a value of, let's change it to a value of 2. I'll change my specular to 0, my transmission to 0, my subsurface scattering to a value of 0, and then my volume indirect. So camera AA is the anti-aliasing, and that is how sharp your image is. The diffuse is how lights bounce off of each other in your room. Sorry, the specular is how like shiny an object is. Transmission represents like glass objects. Subsurface scattering, it represents objects that are translucent, like wax and skin and other thin objects. And then the volume indirect is if you have like environment and atmosphere in there. So I like to keep the settings at 1 for the camera AA, and then my diffuse at a value of 1. Okay, so the second thing that we need to do is go into our AOVs, and we need to add a few AOVs. Now AOV stands for arbitrary output values. So we're going to find our diffuse direct and the indirect, and we click on that arrow to make them active. So what that does is it allows me to click on Arnold view, and by default your Arnold view just has the beauty. Alright, it should have loaded the diffuse direct and indirect in here, so let me close that, and let's see if I can get it in there. Okay, not just yet. Let's just keep on adding them, and maybe it'll load later. Alright, so we have the diffuse, direct, indirect. We're going to grab the specular direct, the specular indirect. Like I said, if you had any sort of objects that are translucent, you can get the subsurface scattering direct and indirect. The transmission, and I think that should be good for right now. Yeah, I think I'm good. Okay, so let's close. I'm gonna go ahead and save this right now, just in case it crashes. Alright, now I'll go to Arnold render view, and I'll click on the start IPR. So it's giving me the beach ball of death. Okay. So let me go ahead and stop this right now. Now you can see that my glass is black right here. And that's because the transmission is set to 0. Alright. So I'll go to beauty and let's just go ahead and continue with that render. So after you click on the render run IPR, or you click on that little play button, you can see it's rendering everything. I have some depth of field on here. I'll probably turn off so I won't affect my render times. So I'm just simply going to click on view, select camera. I'll go into my attribute editor. Shortcut is Control A. And then I'll scroll down here to the Arnold tab and turn off my enabled depth of field. Okay. Just so that I can make sure I'm maximizing all my renders at the highest quality. So it rendered kind of fast. I'm going to click on the view, change the test resolution to half the size. So I don't want to render it full resolution. Okay. So this render does not look very good at all. So I'll go into my render settings. So window, rendering editors, render settings. So I've got these two guys open. Alright. Now I'll click on I'll change the camera AA to 2, and then I'll change the diffuse to a value of 2 as well. So I'm going to keep increasing these values. Well, not the camera AA, but I'm just going to increase the diffuse until I get something that looks really nice. Okay, so you're probably wondering, why did I click all those AOVs and not even use them just yet? I want you to see something really beautiful with the beauty pass, but then I'm going to go into the diffuse direct. Alright, and this is the diffuse indirect. Alright, so direct light that's hitting the objects, and this is the indirect light that is bouncing off of objects. So if I just zoom in here and then middle mouse button to drag, this is what I'm trying to see. Alright, I want to increase the diffuse so that light bounces around this thing enough and illuminates other objects. So I'll increase that to a value of 3. And the higher the value, the more light spill that we get in the scene. And as you can see, the renders are taking just a little bit longer. And as it's rendering, and as we increase the value of the diffuse, in our render settings, you can see something that says diffuse samples. Right now it's at 36. And my camera AA samples is a value of 4 right here, because what it does is it takes a square root of this value. So this is 2 square is 4, and then it also square roots 3, which gives it a value, and it multiplies it by that, or something like that. Okay. So that one took 41 seconds. Just by like a rule of thumb, you could change your camera AA to a value of 4 and get a pretty decent overall render. A value of 5 is going to be, like pretty good render. Anti-aliasing. A value of 6 is going to be a really high quality, and then you can probably go up to 7 or 8. But we want to use the diffuse, the specular, and the transmission by themselves before we rely heavily on the camera AA. So let's see here. That's the diffuse direct, diffuse, indirect, and let me bring it up one more time and let's see what that render looks like. So now my diffuse samples have just gone up. Just give it a second to finish rendering. Okay. So we get 64 diffuse samples, and that's because 4 squared is 16, right? 4 times 4 is 16, and then 16 times the camera AA, which is 2, and this is 2 squared. So this is 4 squared times 2 squared, and that's how we get 64 samples. That's just the math behind it. Okay. So the light is actually bouncing around the scene, really nice. And the reason why it's dark over here in these particular areas is because the cushions are dark. And let me click on the diffuse direct lighting. So yeah, that looks really good. Now this is where the magic happens. We want to write down the values of the diffuse that we get from our renders. So this particular render looks nice. The diffuse direct looks good at a value of 4. So I'll write diffuse, I'll spell it, and then I'll write the number 4, and then in parentheses I'll write 64. So 64 is the number of samples. Alright, so I'll go ahead and keep this image. Now I'll change the diffuse to a value of 0, and I'll change my specular to a value of 1. And I'm going to change my AOV and my render view to specular direct. And you can see a completely different image now. Alright, so this is specular direct, this is specular indirect. Alright. Alright, so this image that you see is the way light is bouncing off of my chrome railing, how light is bouncing off of the glass and other chrome objects. So now I'll increase that value to 2. Alright, so it's still rendering. So you're probably like wondering, what am I looking for? I'm looking for really clean lines. Value 3. I'm looking for a really sharp render for the specular pass. So all these little squares over here are actually paintings, and I put a slight reflectivity on the paintings, so they're not all matte. Okay. So if I click the 1-to-1, it will just kind of frame everything back. I'll change it to specular indirect. And it looks a little choppy, and that's only because of the camera AA. So I'll change this to a value of 4. See what happens with the specular. And now, I think this is actually going to be a good value. You see my settings before. I think I had a 3 for my specular, but I'm just going to increase it to a 4. So on my little sheet of paper, I'm writing specular. I'm writing 4. And then the specular samples says 64. Alright, so this is really important that you write down the number of samples. And what we're doing, we're isolating different layers. Okay, so let's give it a few more seconds to render. Okay. Alright, so that looks really good to me. Alright. Now I'll change my specular to a value of 0, and then I'll change my transmission to a value of 2. Alright. And I'll go to my transmission direct. Let's see, transmission indirect. And there we go. So this is my transmission indirect. And this allows me to see through glass objects. Right? So transmission value of 1. This is what we get in this particular room. At a value of 0, then we can't see anything through there. Alright? So if you have a single layer of glass, then you should put a value of 2. But if we're trying to see through, let's say, 2 glass rooms, like this smaller square is also a glass surface. So it also has 2 layers of glass. So we have this first larger glass window, and that's 2 layers. And then we have the smaller layer of glass, which is also 2 layers. So we want to change our transmission to 4 because there's a total of 4 layers. And that's kind of like the general concept behind that. Alright, and because I don't have any objects that are subsurface scattering, but before I get ahead of myself, let me write transmission. Transmission is at a value of 4, and there are 64 samples. Let's make that 0. Subsurface scattering. I think I have a wax object in here somewhere. So let's change this to subsurface direct. Subsurface. Okay. There we go. So there's subsurface direct, there's subsurface indirect. I can see everything with the direct. So a value of 3. That should be fine. Some light passing through those particular objects. I think these are like plastic objects. Okay, so now I have all the values that I need. Subsurface scattering is 3 and the samples are 28. Right here it says max 28. And then the volume indirect, I'm going to keep it at, I'll keep it at 1. Right? So we stop this render, and I'm going to increase my camera AA to a value of, let's say, 4 would be an average render, 5 would be a moderate to decent render, and then a value of 6 is going to be a really high quality render, and then 7 to 8 is probably going to be best quality. So I'll keep it at a value of 6. And now when I introduce the values for my diffuse, remember before we chose 4, if I change that to 4, look at the diffuse samples. Now it's 576. It's like way overkill. Alright, so I'll change this to a value of 3. Now I have 324 diffuse samples, so it's way too high. If I change that to value of 2, I get 144 diffuse samples. So let me change this to value of 1. And now I have 36 diffuse samples. But before, it was like a value of 64. So let's change that to a value of 2. I know it's a little bit more than what I had before, but that's okay. My specular was 64 samples. So if I change this to 1, that's 36. If I change this to 2, it's 144. If I wanted these particular diffuse samples to be 64, then I could change the camera AA to 5. And then I could change the diffuse to 1. And you see it's still a little bit lower than 64, which was the value I wrote down before. It's at 25. So I changed it to 2, and that's at 100. Alright. But I want to go for a really nice, high quality render, so I'll keep that at value of 6. And then my transmission, change that to value of 2. Alright, so these are my values. And now it's time to get a final render. And then that's when we change it to beauty. So I'm not going to render right now because it might take a little longer than anticipated. But I will show you that particular render. So this is a quality render that I got with the depth of field. Alright. So I hope you guys learned a lot from those particular settings and learning how to optimize your renders. Hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure you subscribe and share my channel. Thank you.